The Vietnam War and the push for US involvement was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. A lie. The Iraq War famously is a result of lies. Wars in Somalia are a result of lies. The Second World War and the German invasion of Poland was a result of carefully constructed lies. That is war by media. Let us ask ourselves, of the complicit media, which is the majority of the mainstream press, what is the average death count attributed to each journalist?
That was Julian Assange at the very top at an anti-war rally in London way back in 2010. And then, of course, the third man. I'm Randy Credico. This is Randy Credico Live on the Fly here on Progressive Radio Network with an all-new show. Today, we have Professor George Samueli, the author of the book, Bombs for Peace, NATO's humanitarian war on Yugoslavia. This guy is really smart and very interesting, and you're going to like him. I've seen him a few times. I interviewed him recently on another network for like 20 minutes. I said, let's do this right. And so here he is with us today. And I just want to make one quick announcement. Next Monday on the 11th is the anniversary of Assange Countdown to Freedom. By the way, it started at WBAI. It's been here and it's been there and it's been everywhere. But we've been running it for 5 years now on the 11th, which is also the day, coincidentally. Julian Assange was on that show along with John Pilger, the very first one, Assange Countdown to Freedom. It's also, coincidentally, the 2-year anniversary or 3-year anniversary now of Julian Assange being renditioned out of the Ecuadorian embassy into the fortress, the Tower of London on the ground, called Balmoral Prison. So we'll be doing a special show next week on Assange on the 11th, and we'll be in DC on the 10th to have another Humorous for Assange show, stand up for Assange show, with a lot of great performers. I can't mention them all because I got to get into this interview, but you'll be able to see it, the entire show live at 7:30 on the 10th, and then we'll be in DC on the following day for a couple of other events. This is NYC Free Assange and Assange Countdown to Freedom are sponsoring this event on the 10th. All right, we're going to play a little bit of Brahms and come back with Professor George Samueli. That was Johann Brahms, Hungarian Dance number 1. Maybe we'll play Hungarian Dance number 5 later. Brahms, of course, was German. He was not Hungarian, but George, and I gave you a big buildup, and I never pronounced your name right, but it is Samueli.
No, Samueli.
Samueli. My goodness, there I go again. Samueli. And I'm sorry, this is twice in 3 days where I've screwed up your name. Does that happen a lot to you?
It does. I mean, the thing to remember it's Hungarian name, so the Z is silent. That's all. The Z is silent, so that you just have to ignore the Z.
I see. Okay, well, I knew. Then it does look like Samueli, right?
That's
So
it, exactly.
it almost sounds Italian when you take the Z out.
Right, with the E, exactly. The E does make it sound Italian. That's right.
I mean, I know how complicated. We talked about this the other day. Hungarian language is. I mean, I've heard linguists say that it's the most difficult language to try to pick up. Even someone that speaks 6 or 7 languages, they get to Hungarian, they say, no, we'll pass there and we'll move on to Romanian language or something.
Exactly, because it's a sui generis language. It doesn't remind you of any other languages. I mean, you have Slavic languages, you have the Romance languages, you have the Germanic languages, and they all kind of remind you. So, if you're not sure about a word, it reminds you of another language, and therefore you can remember the word. But here in Hungarian, it doesn't remind you of anything. So you have to learn every single word by heart, and it's a lot of work.
So we have Latin roots, we have French roots.
Exactly.
The English language is just a polyglot of a ton of languages.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Hungarian language is not.
No, not at all. No, I mean, it's just there are 1 or 2 words it picks up from the Slavic languages, but but most of the words are their own. It's it's the Magyar language, and so you have to memorize every single one of them, and it's a real pain in the neck if it's not your mother tongue.
Yeah, I know we should move on into the subject here, but how many languages do you speak?
I speak, well, the thing is that, once you master the Slavic languages, then, you kind of are able to grapple with many of them. So, I don't know, 5 or 6, but that means that a number of them are just Slavic languages. So it sounds more impressive than it actually is.
I see. All right. Well, it's great to have you here on the Progressive Radio Network in New York City. And of course, there are so many things happening, particularly the focus is on what's happening in Ukraine. And I don't know what to believe. I'm getting a one-sided downpouring of information from mainstream media, corporate media, which is essentially government-controlled media in this country. And it is, some people say, gaslighting. But what's the sense that you get over there of what's happening through the media that's available in Hungary?
Well, Hungary is in a peculiar position because its Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, has really taken a very different position on Ukraine than most of the rest of the European Union and certainly NATO. His view is that this fight has nothing to do with Hungary. Hungary isn't going to get involved. It's not supporting either side. And while as a member of the EU, it'll go along with the EU sanctions, it will not allow Hungarian territory to be used to transport any weaponry or personnel into Ukraine. So it says, nothing goes through Hungary into Ukraine. And there's also another aspect of it. There's no love lost between Hungary and Ukraine because Ukraine actually has a substantial Hungarian minority. As part of that Carpatho-Ukraine had been part of Hungary. Then it got transferred to Czechoslovakia after World War I, but then after World War II, it was then transferred to the USSR, and then it became a part of Ukraine. So this part of Ukraine, this Carpatho-Ukraine, is populated by Hungarians. This Hungarian minority has been treated very badly by this regime, the post-2014 regime. So that's a sore point with Hungary, and that's why the Hungarians really aren't that sympathetic to the Zelensky government. So their view is, look, this is not our war, it's not our fight. Hungary always loses when East and West clash. I mean, Orban has said this again and again. Whoever wins, East or West, Hungary will definitely be the loser. So Hungary is just staying right out of it, and that's why it's a little different from everywhere else. Now today there was an election in Hungary. I mean, I think we should know the results in a couple of hours, but the opposition has attacked Orban for his neutral stance on Ukraine. But Orban has just been absolutely unremitting in saying that we, the government, we're staying out of it, whereas they, the opposition, they want to get involved in it. So if they win the election, Hungary is going to get sucked into this war.
Now, I mean, he's no left-leaning progressive there. I mean, he has gotten a bad rap and generally liked by conservatives in this country. This is the one area where you may break away from them.
Well, that's right. But that's, I think, is an interesting aspect of it, that the right, both the right as in Viktor Orban, but even the right in the United States have been far more skeptical about getting involved in this war than the liberals on the left. I mean, liberals are all gung-ho. They want to start World War III right now. But even on the left, they've by and large gone along with the demonization of Russia and the ridiculous celebration of Ukraine. I mean, there are exceptions, of course. I mean, we think of Aaron Mate, Max Blumenthal, the people around the Gray Zone, and Glenn Greenwald and others. They've been very critical of the whole US approach to Ukraine. But by and large, the liberals on the left have been much more gung-ho than people on the right. So, I mean, if you think of who have been the leading opponents of getting involved in Ukraine, well, it's people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, Steve Bannon, obviously Tucker Carlson. So I think there's much more skepticism on the right, and I think Orban reflects that.
There was some Kentucky congressman that is very skeptical. That I think you might.
Rand, are you thinking of Rand Paul?
No, there was just a congressman. Yes, and I forgot what he said.
Oh yeah, I think I know who you mean.
The libertarian type.
Thomas Massey. Is it Thomas Massey?
Yeah. So you're right, but the liberals, and there is no. Let's be clear about it. There's no left in this country. There's no organized left, whether it be in labor. Right. Nowhere is there an organized left, and you're not getting it from Black leadership in this country. They're all gung-ho for it, just like they were anyone that was politically connected back in the 50s supported the Cold War, even though they supported, civil rights in this country. Ralph Ellison, for example, and the guy who ran one of these big institutes, I'll think of his name in a minute, but Cornel West and I talked about it. These were Cold War liberals. And so we're seeing that right now. Everyone in Congress is beating the drum for war. But I mean, this is a very touchy situation. If there's a conflict, if in fact we push Russia too far, and I don't even know if we're pushing them that far anymore on the economic sanctions. I've heard you talk about how it's really backfired and they're morphing into a different direction. But I mean, one nuclear exchange and the world's over.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is this absolutely reckless talk about, well, let's set up a no-fly zone, or let's send in some NATO peacekeepers. There is no question whatsoever that Russia will regard that as an act of war, and it will immediately go to war with NATO. I mean, there's just no doubt about this. And any such conflict will escalate to nuclear weapons very, very quickly, because Russia will respond by attacking all NATO airfields and air defense forces. It's going to blockade NATO ports. It's going to destroy NATO military infrastructure very, very quickly. I mean, it's going to be done in a matter of days. And then the United States will be left with the option, are we going to start attacking targets on Russian mainland? Once they do that, then all bets are off, because then America is going to start targeting targets on the American mainland and that's going to very quickly escalate to nuclear weapons. So
Yeah.
this is such reckless talk that somehow, or we can hit some target in Russia and Russia isn't going to retaliate. Russia's too afraid to retaliate. No question at all. Russia will retaliate, and it's ready to go all the way for Ukraine.
At this point in time, I concur with you 100%. And NATO, of course, with all the, how many member states are there in NATO right now?
30 member states.
30 member states. And now, if NATO wants to act here, can any one state veto any action?
Well, they not really. I mean, in theory, they should be able to. But in practical terms, as NATO has always been a fig leaf for the United States, essentially it was always front and center was the United States. But NATO provided a cover so that the United States appeared as if it was acting with partners. It wasn't acting on its own. It was acting with partners. But practical terms, who are these partners? You know, Montenegro, Macedonia, Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands. Are they going to have any say in the war? No, I mean they're not. I mean, if the United States decides it's ready to go to war, then that's it. NATO will go to war. I mean, what I think is dishonest.
They can dodge the War Powers Act. They can dodge Congress having to declare war by using NATO as the entry point, right? They don't need approval if it's part of a NATO force. That's
that's it. What's very interesting here is that there's all this invocation of Article 5. Oh, Article 5 means that any attack on a NATO member state means it's an attack on everybody, and therefore NATO goes into action. But that's a lie, because Article 5 presupposes that NATO adheres to Article 1. Article 1 says that no NATO state will get into a conflict with anybody else, and that it will absolutely obligated not to pursue any kind of a military resolution of any conflict. So if NATO picks this fight in Russia, with Russia, and it's already doing so by sending arms to Ukraine, it's essentially no longer agreeing to settle any conflict by peaceful means. By doing so, essentially, NATO is violating Article 1. Well, if you violated Article 1, you can't then invoke Article 5.
Right. So wait a second. So they are sending, I don't know, not heavy artillery. What is actually getting through, and is it sub rosa or is it direct?
Well, it's very hard to know how much is really getting through, because they keep talking about, well, we're sending in all this lethal aid. We're sending in this Javelin anti-tank missiles. We're sending in the Manpads, which are these missiles targeting helicopters. So we got some surface-to-air missiles. But it's hard to know how much is actually getting through. But even if some of it is getting through, that's already a violation of NATO's charter, because NATO's charter is supposed to be defensive. Now, NATO has not been defensive. NATO has been aggressive. NATO has been expansionist. But according to its charter, it's defensive. But of course, if you keep expanding, you keep bringing in new and new countries, and then you keep shifting your borders to the east, then by definition, you're not being defensive. I mean, defensive means you stay put and defend what you've got. When you keep moving your borders, closer and closer to the country you identify as an adversary, which is Russia, and NATO does identify Russia as an adversary, then you're automatically being aggressive. And if you're getting involved in a conflict on behalf of a country that is not a member of NATO, which is Ukraine, if you're getting involved in that, then you are being aggressive. Therefore, that NATO is clearly in violation of its charter.
Right. NATO is 448 as a defense pact, supposedly, and to start out with mostly European countries, and it's expanded. It's all. What do these other countries have to gain by signing off are on with NATO? What are these small countries? It's because they were afraid of Russia. This is after the Soviet Union. They were afraid. Is that the reason why, or were they, arm wrestled into, participating in the NATO structure?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that they were arm wrestled into it. I think a number of countries were kind of coerced, and they kind of dangled NATO membership with EU membership. I mean, the way it always worked was that first you get NATO membership, then a couple of years later you get the EU membership. So a number of the countries, they wanted to be part of the EU. Very nice, you get to travel around, you get subsidies from Germany, but the price of that was membership of NATO. Now, I think that's true for many NATO member states. Some countries, I think, do harbor a very strange animus toward Russia, even 30 years since the end of the Cold War, 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union. But countries like Poland and the Baltic states, their animus toward Russia just seems to be growing. I mean, it's like a whole generation has grown up, with having no memory at all of the Soviet Union, no memory at all of the Cold War, and yet they seem to hate Russia more than the preceding generation. And that's a very strange thing, and I think it's another troubling aspect of NATO, and it was something that the Russians have pointed out, that, hey, you promised us that once these countries entered NATO, then all the bad feelings that history may have generated, all they would disappear. But on the contrary, the bad feelings have got worse and worse and worse, even though Russia has done nothing to Poland in recent times. Russia's done nothing to the Baltic states, but they are just driven by an insane, visceral hatred for all things Russian.
Right. And let me go to, I have to ask this because somebody asked me to ask you about this. Turkey and Greece are both part of NATO. And I guess they're part of the EU as well now. But there's a conflict going on there. My friend is Greek, and he says, the Turks are bothering us all the time. But now what happens then? How does NATO respond if Turkey is making incursions or doing something that undermines the security of Greece?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, back in 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus and took a chunk out of Cyprus. They claimed, the Turkish Cypriots were threatened by the Greek Cypriots, but in fact, Turkey just went in, grabbed itself a piece of territory. It's an illegal act. But NATO has done nothing about at all about this. So there it is. So Greeks are obviously very unhappy about it, and there's constant, as you said, there's a constant conflict between Turkey and Greece over the Eastern Mediterranean, about exploitation of the resources of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's no love lost between them, and certainly it could result in a war, particularly with the president of Turkey, Erdogan, who's a very strange, unstable character. He seems to pick fights with everybody. I mean, he picks a fight with Iran, he picks a fight with Syria, he picks a fight with Greece, he even picks fights with France. He has kind of on and off relationship with Russia. So, you never know. There might well be a war between Turkey and Greece. NATO will do nothing about it, and that's the remarkable thing about NATO. It doesn't actually provide any real security to anyone. So it isn't going to do anything to help Greece, because Turkey is obviously much stronger than Greece. But it doesn't even do much to help the rest of Europe. I mean, when you have these massive migration flows into Europe, you think, well, why isn't NATO at, manning the borders, making sure that, that there isn't just simply the huge flow of migrants into Europe. Not only does NATO not do that, NATO, by exacerbating conflicts, as in Libya. Libya was entirely a NATO operation, and then as a result of which, massive flow of refugees into Europe. NATO has exacerbated the conflict in Syria. Result, massive flow of refugees in Europe. So NATO's very existence is a kind of constantly debilitating the security of Europe.
In your book, Bombs for Peace, you talk about in the very beginning about how NATO has morphed from a defensive organization into an offensive organization. And this actually transpired during the mid-90s with Bosnia-Herzegovina. So was it that they didn't know what to do after the Soviet Union collapsed? They wanted to keep that organization going. I know there's a lot of money in it for defense contractors. Who's driving the show here from your perspective?
Well, that's exactly right. So the Soviet Union, it comes to an end in 1991. Warsaw Pact also comes to an end once the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw all their forces from the Warsaw Pact. And then everyone was obviously expecting, well, now's the time for the peace dividend. NATO, supposedly the defensive alliance, defending Europe against the Red Army hordes, would dissolve itself. But instead, NATO started thinking, well, what can we do? What can we do to become relevant? And the Bosnia thing came along and they said, we've got it. We're going to do humanitarian interventions. There are all these terrible conflicts going on, and people are getting hurt by these conflicts. And so we're going to step in and we're going to be rescuing people who are being hurt in conflicts. The problem there was, of course, that it was NATO itself or the NATO powers that actually causes these conflicts. They actually created the very crises that NATO was then rushed in and said, hey, we're the saviors, we're the rescuers. It really is a classic case of the arsonist playing the role of the fireman.
Right. Well, this goes back, it actually starts when Yugoslavia, which was the last socialist state in Europe, you bring that up, broke apart. Croatia broke apart, and it was down to just like 3 federal republics within Yugoslavia, and the other a couple broke off from it, Slovenia as well. And then you got Bosnia Herzegovina in 1995. Before I get into that, just could you encapsulate how Yugoslavia from 1918, when it was created, all the way through World War II, and then up when Tito took over, up until 1991. Just take us through that history briefly, if you could.
Well, Yugoslavia was created in the aftermath of World War I, and its component nations, which as it was initially called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, they all came from different empires, all the empires that broke up as a result of World War I. So the Serbs actually had their own state. So Serbia existed as a state in 1914, but the Croats and the Slovenes, Croatia had been a part of the Kingdom of Hungary. Hungary was, of course, it was a part of Austria-Hungary, but the Slovenes had been a part of Austria. So they joined together, but then subsequently other territories conjoined into Yugoslavia, so like Bosnia.
Is this the result of the Treaty of Versailles? I mean, when was this decided?
Well, no, that was a much more of a spontaneous thing of creating Yugoslavia. So the Versailles didn't really have much to do with that, but it was accepted as part of the post-World War I arrangement, because Yugoslavia became an ally of France. France created this little entente in Eastern Europe, like Yugoslavia, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all of whom were aligned with France, very much opposed to the Soviet Union, which is also a result of World War I. So this was kind of the French attempt to contain Germany. So it'll contain Germany, and it will contain the Soviet Union. But that Yugoslavia, which became subsequently was renamed the Kingdom of Yugoslavia when other entities like Bosnia-Herzegovina and Macedonia joined, it was the king of Yugoslavia had been the king of Serbia. So it was dominated by the Serbs, but the Serbs were the most populous nation within Yugoslavia, and they were essentially rewarded for being on the right side of World War I, because the others had really all been on the wrong side. So like Croatia and Slovenia had been, they're part of Austria-Hungary, so they were on the other side, the losing side. And so, but the Serbs were rewarded until, of course, Hitler's attack on April the 6th of 1941. He destroyed Yugoslavia, and then he created a fascist-dominated Croatia, Ustaša Croatia, and Croatia also then incorporated Bosnia-Herzegovina. So it was a very big Croatian territory, and they committed most horrific atrocities. I mean, they ran that death camp Jasenovac, in which they committed horrific murder, mass murder of Serbs, but there were others, of course, Jews, gypsies that the Croatians committed crimes against. The Croats, tried to justify it in later years. Well, we were so badly treated within the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, we were discriminated against by the Serbs, but nothing that they had to endure in Yugoslavia could justify the horrific crimes that the Ustaša committed. They were so horrific that even the Germans were shocked by the brutality of the Croats. So when Yugoslavia was then reconstituted after 1945, and it became the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia under the leadership of Tito and the communists, a lot of these crimes were kind of swept under the rug because they wanted to make the state a kind of going concern. But also Tito didn't really care that much about the Croatian crimes. He was much more preoccupied with his chief adversary during the Second World War, which was the royalists, the Serb royalists, which is Mihailovic. That was his real enemy. So he wasn't that concerned with all what the Croatians had done as Hitler's allies. So a lot of it was swept under the rug, as opposed to the supposed crimes of Mihailovic, who had actually been on the same side as Tito, but he was a royalist, Tito was a communist, and so they had a political clash. But anyway, so the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia reconstituted. He has a falling out, Tito has a falling out with Stalin, and then Yugoslavia becomes cultivated. The West suddenly seizes on him and say, hey, this is great. We now have a kind of an anti-Soviet entity here in the Balkans. And so people love Tito. He was showered with lots of funds and everything because they kept pushing him, because this would be quite a useful alternative, a kind of a communist alternative to the Soviet Union. But this very process actually then worked against Yugoslavia when the Cold War ended, because while the West was keen to say, oh, look, here's Yugoslavia, they've got workers' self-management, they've got decentralization, they're not practicing that kind of state socialism that the Soviet Union has practiced. Now, when the Soviet Union disappeared, the West saw the SFRY as a real problem, because this might be an alternative, attractive model of socialism. They didn't want that. It was okay to have an alternative to the kind of Stalinist or neo-Stalinist system of the Soviet Union. They didn't want this to be a kind of, hey, we don't want to go down the liberal capitalist a West way, why not have this kind of social democratic, non-Soviet style socialism? So they were absolutely determined from 1990 on to destroy the SFRY.
So they find an opening. You have some breakaway states there, Croatia and Slovenia, and so they see this. They zero in on it, and this is where they're planning to reinvent themselves, even though they call themselves a defensive pact still. And we go into 95. So let's go into 95. What happens there in Bosnia and NATO's response, and then we'll talk about.
I think this is where I think it's important just to step back a little bit, because 1990 they have the first elections in Yugoslavia, and a variety of nationalists come to power. So Croatia, they come to power. This nationalist Tuđman, Franjo Tuđman, who was basically, an apologist for the Ustasha. He's actually said, the Ustasha expressed a legitimate nationalist aspirations of Croatia. So they win an election, and the first thing they do, that's in Croatia, is they change the constitution to kick the Serbs out of as the status as a constituent nation. That's a very important point, because Croatia, according to its constitution, had been comprised of two constituent nations. So it wasn't like Croatia is the nation state of the Croats. They said Croatia was the nation state of the Croats and the Serbs. So Tuđman changes the constitution and says, basically, it's just the nation state of the Croats. He does that, and then he holds a referendum on independence. Now, he shouldn't have been able to do that, because any fundamental constitutional changes have to come by the consensus of both constituent nations. So that's why it was very important for him to kick the Serbs out as the constituent nation, and then to have the referendum on independence, which the Serbs, of course, said they're going to boycott. They're not going to take part in this referendum, because it's an illegal, illegitimate exercise, since we, the Serbs, as a constituent nation, don't approve of it. The Constitutional Court of Yugoslavia agreed with the Serbs. They said, no, this is an illegal, unconstitutional act to have a referendum on independence. And that Constitutional Court, incidentally, was not a Serb-dominated court. It had 8 members of the Constitutional Court. So the 6 republics and the 2 provinces of Serbia, which is Kosovo and Vojvodina. And they unanimously said, no, this is an illegal and unconstitutional exercise. Nonetheless, Croatia had its referendum, as did Slovenia. They voted, the referendum question was almost completely meaningless, but they voted for independence. And then Germany stepped in. This is Germany, few months after the reunification, few months after Germany made all sorts of promises to the world that, oh, we're never going to do anything that is destructive or warlike. Only peace will emanate from German soil. A few months after they get this, after all the promises they made, they rush in and say, we're going to recognize the independence of Croatia and Slovenia. The Europeans were hesitant, but Germany kind of bullied the rest of Europe to go along with it.
How could they do that, by the way? I mean, they were a strong economic state, but they were not militarily strong. They were pretty much neutralized, weren't they?
Exactly, but they used their economic muscle, because that was at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, and they gave all sorts of those, which basically kind of sealed the deal on the kind of on the European Union as a political entity. But Germany had the economic muscle, say, hey, you want some help from us? We'll help you out, because that sealed the deal on the economic and monetary union. So if you want, help with your currencies, stick with us. And, Germany got its way. And at the time, the United Nations Secretary General Perez de Cuellar said, this is absolute disaster. You recognize Croatian Slovenian independence, you're guaranteed, what's guaranteed is that Bosnia-Herzegovina is going to also want independence. And, and if that happens, it is guaranteed that there will be war, because the Serbs were about 20% of Croatia's population. They were not going to accept an independent Croatia, but Bosnia, the Serbs were, about 35, 36% of the population. So if they say we don't want to have anything to do with independent Bosnia, there's going to be war. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. But nonetheless, Germany went ahead. They pushed ahead for this independence. The Europeans went along with it, and of course, Perez de Cuellar was right. It guaranteed war. You can't just ram some major constitutional change on people, when they're ferociously opposed to it. They wanted to stay in Yugoslavia. That was their common state, and they didn't want to be members of states that had nothing to do with them. You're a Serb living in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's it. You're a citizen of Yugoslavia. Suddenly, Yugoslavia is no more, and you just have to accept being a citizen of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the Serbs just simply weren't going to accept this.
Wow. Well, this, I don't know if this is a correct analogy, but, Catalonia, this would be like Catalonia having their referendum, and there are people who didn't want it there, but a majority did, but it wasn't recognized by Spain at all, and they came down in a very heavy-handed way. And so, why did NATO step in there?
It's a very good analogy. That's a very, very good analogy. Not only did Spain not recognize the referendum, it arrested the referendum leaders, and the European Union supported the Spanish central government. So you can see, because of these double standards, what was it that Europe wanted? Europe wanted to destroy Yugoslavia. So in the case of Yugoslavia, they wanted the country to break up, and so they went ahead and supported what Germany did, and they had to do it very quickly. So they were moving really fast. It had to be a matter of weeks and months. So imagine you've got, let's say, a conflict like Israel-Palestine. Well, that's been going on since 1948. Israel has occupied lands since 1967. No one's in any hurry. That's fine. That's already, 50 years go by, and no one is pushing anyone. Hey, we got to sit down and work out a peace treaty. We got to, have decide what are going to be the frontiers. Oh, let's just keep it going. But in this case, in the case of Yugoslavia, suddenly everything had to be rushed. Boom, boom, boom. It had to be, Croatia and Slovenia, they say that they're independent, announced their independence June 25th, 1991. By December, so that's 6 months later, already Germany recognizes that they're independent. So that's within 6 months. Then the rest of Europe goes along with Germany, January 1992, and then April 1992, the United States and Europe recognize Bosnia-Herzegovina also as independent. So this all takes place within a matter of months. No attempt is made to negotiate anything, because after all, when states break up, there's a lot of things to negotiate. I mean, what happens? How do you divide up the assets? How do you divide up the debts, the taxes, the customs revenue, investments, and so on? A lot of things to negotiate. There was no attempt at all. They were just going to ram that through, and because they thought this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to break up, states that might cause problems for us, but also they wanted to eliminate Russian influence from Europe, because the Serbs had always been Russia's little brother. So, and therefore, if we could just simply really, break up Serbia. So the Serbs are now stuck in all sorts of different countries. You got 1/3 of Serbia's population now finds itself in different states. You've kind of eliminated Russia's influence in the Balkans.
Right. That's amazing. We're going to take a quick break here and get back and talk about the Bosnian War in 1 second. Here is a little Shostakovich. He'll be right back with the great professor, and he'll have to pronounce his name because I'm not going to try it again. All right? Right after this quick break. Okay, we're back. I'm Randy Credico. This is Randy Credico Live on the Fly. Also, Assange Countdown to Freedom. I don't think we're going to get into Assange today, even though we're a week away from the 3-year rendition of Mr. Assange from Ecuadorian embassy into this medieval fortress called Belmarsh. And we're talking to Doctor, Professor, and I'm going to try it again, and I'm going to correct it in editing. Samuele. I'm going to just phonetically write that out the next time we speak. But you know what? No one ever got my name right all the way, and it was much easier to pronounce. But now one of my grade school teachers says Credeco. They never said Credico. Never, not once. So, am I the only person that is may have a problem? I know George Galloway had no problem, but you guys have each other.
Right. No, but your name is not so difficult. I mean, the difficulty is, of course, the R's, and the many people have real difficulties with the letter R. George Galloway really, he really rolls his R's. To get your name right, you have to roll your R's.
Credico. All right.
Credico.
I'm going to say Credico. It's an Italian name. It's from southern Italy somewhere, which has got like some Greek, background to it. So now let's get to this. How that flashpoint there, those elections and the recognition. Germany's sinister, designs and motivations, and the West. Were they looking at that time to also facilitate NATO's putting lipstick on the pigsty?
Well, I think at that stage, their only goal was eliminating Russia's influence in Europe by kind of humiliating and destroying the Serbs, and the view that here the socialist alternative to the kind of liberal capitalist system will have disappeared. So therefore, those East European countries who might balk at privatization and the whole rush to embrace kind of this neoliberal, capitalist agenda, they won't be able to point to, hey, well, why don't we kind of not go down that neoliberal way? Why don't we go down the sort of alternative kind of Yugoslav way? So that was gone. That's it. That disappeared. And so now you had, instead of one single state of the SFRY, you had 6 states, 6 tiny little states with a lot of mutual antagonism. And of course you had war. There was a war going on in Croatia. Again, the Serbs refused to go along with an independent Croatia, but there was a serious war going on in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So, and that was a multi-sided war, because there was a war going on between the Serbs and the Muslims, but there was also another war going on between the Muslims and the Croats of Bosnia. So that was, then there was, that was when the drumbeat started. Well, NATO, there was that cliche of the time, out of area or out of business. So if NATO wants to continue to be relevant, then NATO has to get involved in Bosnia, has to go in, and they had to, and who's the villain? The villain was the Serbs who weren't going to go along with the breakup of Yugoslavia, which had been decreed by Germany, by the United States, by the European Union. They said that this is the way it's going to break up, and the Serbs have just better lump it. So, you're stuck between all these different countries. You've got one part of your population, Croatia, one part in Bosnia and Herzegovina, one part in Serbia. Tough luck. You just have to lump it. So they were regarded as the villains. And so if NATO was going to get involved, it would be to target the Serbs. And that's in fact what they did. So, they decided that here the Serbs were the horrible people, and that NATO had to invent a role for itself by bombing the Serbs.
I see. And so this lasts how long, that first conflict before?
Well, the war came to an end in December 1995 in the Bosnia-Herzegovina war. So the first bombing of the Serbs took place in 1994, and then the much bigger bombing took place in 1995, and that was really pushed by the United States to ensure that somehow Serbs won't win the war. So essentially, the United States, NATO, they entered the war in 1995 on the side of the Croats and the Muslims. By that time, the Croats and the Muslims had made up under US sponsorship. The United States wanted a kind of a joint alliance against the Serbs. So, the United States, based under NATO, they just joined forces there, and there was a land offensive by the Croats and the Muslims, and that went together with an aerial offensive by NATO. And so,
did NATO send troops in?
NATO did not send troops in there. No. But NATO never really sends troops in. I mean, NATO is, it prefers the coward's war. It prefers bombing, just bomb, because it's easy to do when you're up against much weaker opposition. The much weaker opposition doesn't really have ability to shoot down NATO aircraft.
Who's flying these planes, by the way? They're probably mostly Brits and U.S. Marines or Navy helicopters. Pilots that are participating. You don't have pilots from Belgium flying these planes, aren't they?
No. As I say, NATO is essentially a kind of a fig leaf for the United States. Everything is done by the United States. Nobody else has any say on it. But it's very good that if it's done like NATO, then it doesn't look like it's the United States that's throwing its weight around. And then you get the New York Times that refers to the Allies, uppercase A, the Allies, which makes people think, oh yeah, that's World War II, the Allies, together again, and that's how they refer to NATO, the Allies.
Right. The coalition. NATO was involved. NATO was involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. But before that, when they really made their bones again, was in '99. So walk us through that history there, George.
Well, that was so Madeleine Albright. She becomes Clinton's Secretary of State, January 1997. She is a big interventionist. And she sees, the testing of U.S. foreign policy, the testing of NATO in taking down the Serbs, and in particular, she targets the leader of the Serbs, who was Slobodan Milosevic. And she figures that the way to do it, the way to take him down, was to intervene in Kosovo. Kosovo was an autonomous province of Serbia. And you know, this essentially they Albright decided that, oh, these poor Kosovo Albanians. I mean, so the majority population of Kosovo was Albanians. So these poor Kosovo Albanians were terribly persecuted by the Serbs. And so there was the constant drumbeat about how the Albanians were being prosecuted. But most seriously, the United States and Germany sponsored a terrorist movement within Kosovo. This is the Kosovo Liberation Army. The whole purpose of this terrorist movement was not to win power. They weren't formidable enough to provide any serious military opposition to the Serbs. But what they could do was to provoke the Serbs into violence, into atrocities, and then NATO could use the atrocities as the justification to bomb the Serbs. So 97, 98, the Kosovo Liberation Army comes into existence, and they commit all sorts of terrorist atrocities. So the Serbs respond, and then every time they respond, the media under US guidance start tearing their hair out and getting hysterical about these horrific atrocities, always against civilians. Yet always the civilians are the targets. But look what the Serbs are doing, these terrible, terrible atrocities. And so finally, they tried to create this casus belli to get into this war, which was Račak. So in Račak, this was a village held by the Kosovo Liberation Army. That there was a firefight between the Serb forces, Serb Yugoslav forces, and the KLA. KLA people were killed, and then the Serbs left, and in came the OSCE Kosovo verification mission led by William Walker, who had been US ambassador to El Salvador back in the 1980s, and that at the height of the civil war in El Salvador. So William Walker comes in and said, "Oh, this is absolutely horrific. The Serbs had executed, civilians. So this is a crime scene. Serbs had executed civilians, and then basically was calling for NATO intervention against the Serbs." That wasn't sufficient to get the job done. So they had to do something else. And so they essentially issued an ultimatum to the Serbs. They say, you better show up for this conference we're going to have in Rambouillet, France. You better show up. We will draft a constitutional arrangement for Kosovo, and you better accept and sign off on this draft. And if you don't do it, basically, we're going to bomb you. So the Serbs, they go to Rambouillet. The Kosovo Albanians, at that time led by the KLA, terrorist organization, yet the Americans were happy to have the KLA lead.
Like Al-Qaeda.
Like Al-Qaeda. They came there, and of course, at this meeting, there were no negotiations. The Americans were kind of drafting this agreement, absolutely humiliating agreement for the Serbs, where basically, essentially the Kosovo would be independent of Serbia, but Serbia would not be independent of Kosovo. So, the Kosovo would not have to pay any taxes to Serbia. Serbia would have no say in anything that happened in Kosovo, but Serbia would still have to provide welfare payments. Serbia would still have to provide infrastructure investment. But any investment that went to Kosovo, Serbia wouldn't get a slice of that. But any
I'm going to stop you right there. I have to stop you right there. We're going to, for the listeners here in New York City on Progressive Radio Network, we're going to continue with Professor Dr. Samueli. How is that?
That's it. That was very good.
And so if you could stick around, and we'll put it on the website later. I want to say goodbye to the listeners here, but you'll be able to get the whole thing later on. We're going to go out with Brahms again, a Hungarian dance, number 5. And goodbye, New York. And we'll be back for everybody else here. Okay, we are back. I'm Randy Credico live on the fly here on the Progressive Radio Network, Assange Countdown to Freedom, with Professor, Dr. Author, and columnist, they call you. I've seen your work in Counterpunch and antiwar.com and many other places. You've been doing this for a long time. You know your stuff, and it's really great to have you on the show. We were just talking about this agreement at Rambouillet that it had poison pills in it. And so what happens when they reject? Tell us, they reject.
Well, that's so. So they give this humiliating position, which is basically Serbia just have to go on subsidizing Kosovo, while Kosovo doesn't have to pay anything at all to Serbia. And they present this to the Serbs. Now, remember, the Serbs know, Milosevic knows perfectly well, NATO is looking for an excuse to bomb his country. So he says, okay, this is okay, this is not a bad deal. This is something we can talk about. So this was a problem, because what Madeleine Albright was trying to do was to get the Serbs to reject this agreement, get the Kosovo Albanians to accept the agreement, and then she could say, hey, that's it. We had this reasonable peace agreement. The Serbs rejected it. The Albanians accepted it. Now we can bomb the Serbs. But the Serbs said, okay, well, we can work with this. So then Albright added something called Appendix B to this agreement. Now, this Appendix B was said that NATO would be able to essentially occupy all of Yugoslavia. They could just move wherever they wanted. They would enjoy complete immunity, and no.
This is where NATO troops could come in at this point.
NATO troops would come in, not just into Kosovo, but into Serbia proper, and they could travel around without giving any notice what they were doing, and whatever they wanted to do, they would just have complete, unrestricted freedom of movement, freedom of action, and complete immunity from any prosecution. This was Appendix B, and this the Serbs said, no, we're not going to allow that. The problem for Albright was like, great, now we can start bombing. The problem was that the KLA, the Kosovo Albanians, they weren't happy with the agreement either, because there was no promise of independence. I mean, they came there thinking they'd be promised, hey, you can have independence in a couple of years. And Albright would have been happy to promise them independence, but the NATO partners said, well, this is a bit of a problem. We can't go around breaking up states, because if you break up this state, who's to say that our state isn't going to break up next? So, you have countries like Spain, which is, as you mentioned, I mean, this is kind of a brittle construct. They're afraid that somebody's going to try and break up Spain. So they said, well, we can't accept a referendum on independence for the Kosovo Albanians. So this was the Rambouillet talks. And there was a stalemate. Both sides had rejected the American plan. If both sides rejected it, NATO couldn't bomb. So they went home, and then Albright and the rest of them, they started pushing pressure on the Kosovo Albanians. They look, please accept this agreement. You'll get your independence. We can't say it explicitly. We can't say it out loud, but we promise you that you will get this referendum on independence within a couple of years, but just keep quiet about it. Don't go on about that. So the Kosovo Albanians said, all right, then we accept the agreement. So back they come for the second time, for the second round of Rambouillet. The Serbs, they still say no to Appendix B. The Kosovo Albanians say, yeah, okay, we accept, and that's it. Within 48 hours, the bombs were flying, because, this was it. They had the justification for, or what the purported justification for bombing the Serbs.
This was like a scorched earth bombing,
right,
basically.
Exactly. It was.
And
then
there are a lot of attempts at talks, but they were always sabotaged.
That's right. That's right. And of course, what happened was that once the bombs started flying, refugees started, flowing out of Kosovo, and NATO seized on this and said, "Oh, look, they are fleeing Serbia because the Serbs are such monsters. They are fleeing for their lives. That's why we had to bomb." So they used that as the justification for the bombing, having lied to the public, because the public really didn't know anything about these Rambouillet negotiations. They didn't know anything about Appendix B. As far as the public was concerned, oh yeah, we're bombing the Serbs because all these poor refugees are flowing out of Kosovo, and they're not even able to put two and two together and say, yeah, but the refugees only started fleeing Kosovo after you started bombing. They got the cause and effect, the reverse. And so then, but NATO kept saying, yeah, this is why we had to bomb. Look what the terrible things that the Serbs are doing. So it was a complete lie. And nobody knew about that whole story of Appendix B until about a month into the bombing, when it came out. And then it was already too late, because you can't just simply, bring it to a halt, because then American credibility is on the line. And so you have to just keep, bombing and bombing and bombing. And this went on for 11 weeks.
So I've seen some of the pictures. Now, I mean, I remember it then. Wesley Clark was the commander of NATO. Right. There was bombings. I remember a train that was going like 5 miles an hour.
Exactly.
And he said that it was speeding, and they dropped bombs on a train. There were a lot of war crimes committed back then, but there was no call for the U.S. and NATO nations to appear before the ICC.
No, exactly, the ICTY. That's right. That's a very good example about the train. They bombed the bridge in broad daylight. So there was always a chance that you're going to kill the civilians when you bomb broad daylight. But worse than that, they bombed the bridge while there was a passenger train along that bridge. And that was no question, that was a war crime. There were refugee convoys that they bombed. So there was a very.
Did they bomb the Chinese embassy?
And they bombed the Chinese embassy. Now, that was itself an interesting case, because initially the Americans said, oh, this was an accident. And they had to, the Chinese were obviously furious about it. And the Americans said, oh yeah, we're very, very sorry, we'll pay you compensation or whatever. But then the Americans started hinting to the media, well, actually, it wasn't accidental. We did it deliberately, because the Chinese were helping the Serbs, so we had to teach them a lesson. So the Americans wanted to have it both ways. Whoa, yeah, very, very sorry. We were using an out-of-date map, but to the gullible media, hey, we did it. We needed to show the Chinese who's the boss and what's what. So
I'm looking at these photos even now. These were not military installations. I mean, we're looking at a lot of buildings, a lot of homes. You talk about 11 straight weeks, on Belgrade, 11 straight weeks of it, nonstop, unrelenting. There were, what gave them the right to go into Belgrade to do this? They didn't make an incursion anywhere.
Right. No, there was no. I mean, it was obviously a violation of the North Atlantic Treaty, which it's supposed to be purely defensive. We don't pick a fight with anyone. Um, Violation, obviously, of the United Nations Charter, and above all, a violation of international law, because Yugoslavia posed no threat to any country. It wasn't pursuing any kind of aggressive war against anyone. There was no threat to any country, and it had no connection whatsoever to NATO. And NATO just simply went ahead and bombed it just to show, hey, we are relevant. But ultimately, this went on for 11 weeks, but they weren't really getting anywhere because the Serbs were, they were absolutely obdurate. And then NATO did something really vicious, which is essentially they said, well, if you don't cave to us, we are just going to destroy Belgrade. We're going to absolutely level Belgrade. So they sent this negotiator, Martti Ahtisaari, kind of a former Finnish prime minister. He went to Milosevic and said, we've run out of all targets. But if you don't cave, we're just going to level Belgrade. And, he gave a kind of a demonstration with his hands, just like knocking all the buildings over. There's just going to be nothing left of Belgrade. And then, Milosevic, finally accepted their terms. But even those terms were not at all the terms that NATO was asking. So Serbia actually gained quite a lot because, for instance, that Appendix B, that had to go. Basically, that whole NATO can move anywhere it wanted. That's gone. NATO had no right to enter Serbia proper, and then even NATO did enter Kosovo, but it had to be under UN authority. So, and all the talk about independence for Kosovo ended as far as the UN Security Council resolution was concerned. Now, what happened subsequently is, of course, as always, NATO and the United States lied and cheated and went back on the agreement. But as far as the agreement that authorized at least NATO's entry into Kosovo, UN Security Council Resolution 1244, I think Serbs gained quite a lot. But, then the Americans, of course, went back on their word, despite the fact that the resolution said there were to be no changes, fundamental constitutional changes, without the consent of everybody, including the United Nations. But they went ahead, told the Kosovo Albanians, why don't you just declare independence? We will recognize your independence. Precisely what the resolution said you can't do. They went ahead. In 2008, the Kosovo declared independence, and the NATO countries immediately rushed in to recognize its independence.
And are they part of NATO now?
No, they're not. And
Croatia's not, right?
Croatia is a member of NATO. Yeah.
Serbia definitely is. Serbia definitely.
No, Serbia is not. No, Serbia is not a member of NATO. I mean, that's the holdout. Serbia and Bosnia Herzegovina, which is, after all, it has basically been partitioned into a kind of Muslim Croat federation and a Republika Srpska, kind of a Serbian entity. So that Serb entity is, refusing to join NATO. So Bosnia Herzegovina, Serbia are the only holdouts as far as NATO is concerned. Kosovo is problematic because while the West, the usual cast of characters, recognized the independence of Kosovo, most of the world didn't. And if most of the world doesn't, then Kosovo isn't a member of the United Nations. Kosovo cannot join the United Nations. But the problem with Kosovo is also that they can't join the European Union or NATO because there are member states of both that basically they don't support unilateral declarations of independence. So Spain, for instance, absolutely refuses to have Kosovo in NATO or in the European Union. Slovakia also, because Slovakia is very worried about its Hungarian minority. Slovakia also, nope, we can't have Kosovo. Romania, also worried about its Hungarian minority, said, nope, we're not going to have Kosovo. So they kind of stuck. They have this entity, Kosovo, but it's not a member of the UN, and it's not even a member of NATO or the EU.
Wow. Well, that's fascinating. So this comes to an end, and in 1999, a lot of atrocities committed. Only one person is brought before the ICC, and that was Milosevic, right?
Well, there were a lot of Serbs. That was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That was an ad hoc court.
ICTY, yes.
Yeah, ICTY. That was set up by, the UN Security Council, but chiefly by Madeleine Albright. She kind of pushed for it. So they had a number of Serbs, but it was pretty much, only the Serbs were prosecuted, not wholly, but in terms of who was charged with genocide, in terms of who received hefty prison sentences, it was nearly all the Serbs. So something like 85% of the years that were handed down by the ICTY were prison terms handed to Serbs. So
anybody from NATO? I mean, Wesley Clark didn't.
No NATO member was ever prosecuted for anything at the ICTY. A few Croats, but not even Croatian, a few Bosnian Croats, a few Kosovo Albanians, few Bosnian Muslims, but overwhelmingly it targeted the Serbs in Croatia, the Serbs in Bosnia, and of course the Serbs of Serbia.
So this action in 95, 99 was the first time since the inception in 48 of NATO that they actually engaged in any conflict.
That's right.
All that time up until 91, 92 with the Soviet Union, there was nothing. This is the first time where they showed their muscle, and they've continued ever since. So we'll jump to 2011. We talked about it earlier in Libya. And give us an overview of Libya. What really sparked NATO's intervention there?
Well, I think that, again, you had the situation in which NATO, looking for an excuse to justify itself, and you had the familiar kind of liberal interventionists who were back in power. So, you think of the Clinton era, which was the heyday of the Madeleine Albright, the humanitarian interventionism. Anthony Blinken was there. He was a member of that whole, the Bosnia Yugoslavia bombing.
And Richard Holbrooke.
Richard Holbrooke, very much so. So then you have the Bush years, which was also interventionist, but not so much humanitarian interventionist. I mean, they were just simply, they were going after Iraq. Back they come to power under Obama, and in no time they're already looking for some crisis which they could exploit to show, the wonderful nature of humanitarian intervention, the so-called responsibility to protect. So we can just go in anywhere we want on the justification that we have a responsibility to protect. So you have Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State. You have Susan Rice. She's the permanent representative of the United Nations. And then you've got Samantha Power. Samantha Power, she kind of was almost the inventor of the humanitarian interventionist doctrine. So they kind of got together and seized on Libya as this is the wonderful opportunity to show what humanitarian intervention is about. And then Hillary Clinton, who still had at that time, presidential ambitions, this would be her war. She would show, hey, NATO bombs, look what they've done. Gaddafi was had been a problem for the West. I mean, for years, he'd never gone along with the Western imperial schemes, but he was also a juicy target in that he didn't have any real allies. Russia, he'd always had difficult relations with Russia. So they saw this would be a wonderful opportunity, and as with in the case of Yugoslavia, you know, you had the whole ridiculous stories appearing in the media, like Gaddafi threatened genocide. You know, Gaddafi was feeding his soldiers Viagra so that they can carry out mass rapes. You know, all the usual stuff that we were getting through during the 1990s. You know what happened? NATO went in and devastated that country. I mean, it's still destroyed. It still doesn't have a central government. I mean, that was 11 years have gone by, and it still doesn't have a government. I mean,
is NATO? Wait, is NATO still there? Is NATO still like policing it, or they just left it on fire and got out?
Right. I mean, it's just a chaotic situation. I mean, NATO's not bombing anything, but you know, it's basically just a divided country, and they're not able to set up any kind of a central government which they had, and you still have a mass migration flow from Libya because Gaddafi, you know, kept it under control. I mean, he basically kept, you know, he himself said, "I'm saving Europe because I'm preventing the flow of migrants into Europe." I mean, that's why he actually had good relations with Italy, particularly with Berlusconi. He said, "I'm saving you because I'm preventing the flow of migrants into Europe." So that, you know, that came to an end with the end of Gaddafi. And then you've got horrible things that happened, like the return of slavery, you know, just, you know, slave markets.
Who's got the oil fields? Who's got the oil fields?
That's divided up, because you have one government in the east and you have a government in the west. So no one actually has control of all of the oil fields.
You notice the U.S. And NATO don't get involved in countries that don't have some kind of rich natural resource or commodity. You know what I mean? You don't see them in the Sudan or places of that nature. It's always like Cuba, which has got beautiful beaches, and then you got Colombia, and Bolivia's got natural gas, and it's all these Afghanistan.
That's right. And of course, Ukraine is a great example, because they wanted Ukraine because Ukraine had been created artificially as an artificial creation by the Bolsheviks, but they made it extra large. It was ridiculously too large. But, you know, it had a lovely Black Sea coast, and then it had a coast of the Azov Sea, and the biggest prize of all, the Crimean Peninsula. Now, the Crimean Peninsula, NATO was really eyeing that, because that, that it had been leased to Russia. But once this, the coup that took place in 2014, this very anti-Russian coup that seized power in 2014, they were going to take Crimea from Russia. That was always the plan. They were going to say, "Hey, we want Crimea back," and then Russia would be squeezed completely out of the Black Sea. So they were really eyeing Ukraine. They were salivating that here, basically, we're going to take over Crimea, take it away from Russia, and Russia will lose its outlet to the Black Sea. It was a wonderful idea, but I think the Russians were very well aware of this plan, which is why Putin moved right away for Crimea to reincorporate it within the Russian Federation. But even now, they're essentially making Ukraine smaller and smaller, because they're going to create a kind of a buffer state in the east of the country. They're going to take over. The Azov Sea is already basically now the Russian own it, and they could take over most of the Black Sea coast. So they're going to leave the rest of Ukraine a kind of a landlocked country. They say, okay, if NATO wants that, NATO can have it, but that's not the prize NATO wanted. NATO wanted that big country with that big Black Sea coastline and that juicy Crimean Peninsula. That was the goal that NATO was after.
it all comes down to that. It's about resources and money. But for Russia, and you can't even talk about this. So you just mentioned it, the coup in 2014, and you had the same players you mentioned earlier that were involved in Libya, still with the Obama administration, orchestrating all of this. Am I correct?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The people who were involved in that coup, which was Victoria Nuland, they were absolutely instrumental in that. And of course, you had all those people, this like Susan Rice, she was there. Obama, she's still in the Biden administration. Samantha Power, she was in the Obama administration. She's in the Biden administration. What they were seeking, they couldn't quite complete within the Obama years. So this is 2014. Obama's out, or the Democrats are out in 2016. So the moment they return, they want to complete the job they started in 2014, which is to bring Ukraine into NATO. That was always the plan. There's a lot of nonsense talked about, oh, no one was planning to bring Ukraine into NATO. That was all just empty talk. No, there was absolutely determined plan to bring Ukraine into NATO. They made that commitment in 2008. And the moment the Biden people came to power, the people who had been there, who were involved in that coup, the 2014 coup, very much the Biden family, which they were very heavily involved in Ukraine, they immediately pushed for Ukraine membership of NATO. So we have last October, Blinken and then the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, they go to Kiev and they tell Kiev the road to NATO membership is open. There's no talk about, oh, well, maybe someday, who knows, let's have lunch. No, they said the road to NATO membership is open. Then Zelensky comes to the United States, comes to Washington, and in November, the United States and Ukraine sign a strategic partnership. It's a strategic partnership. It's a document saying that United States and Ukraine are now strategic partners, and that United States will endeavor to get Ukraine into NATO. It's there. They signed this.
That's public, right?
It's public. You could just look it up. Do a Google, say United States, Ukraine, NATO, United States, Ukraine strategic partnership. I think they signed it November 2021 or December 21. That's it. So it's out in the open. There it was. The plan was always to get Ukraine into NATO and to do it as soon as possible. And all the talk that we get that, oh, there were no real plans to do it, it's just all lies. Yeah, there were plans. Russia was very well aware of these plans, and which is why Russia's tone from about last November 2021 onwards, had become very serious. This wasn't idle threats. They were now saying very seriously that you're going to have to change your strategy, because we will take measures against it, because they knew very well that the Biden administration was determined to get Ukraine into NATO. And once Ukraine was into NATO, then Russia's options were very limited, because then if it tried to do anything about Ukraine, it would, then Article 5 might go into operation, and then Russia is involved in a full-scale war with NATO. So rather than wait,
why would they gamble? Why would the Biden administration or NATO gamble, knowing that there was going to be a consequence? You can't push someone in and put them in a death throat against the wall, because their whole survival dependent on having access to the Black Sea, having access to all of these areas.
It's a very good question. I think they behave with extraordinary recklessness. Yeah, because Russia had been given clear warnings. Putin says, he makes a very big speech in November 2021. He talks about Russia's red lines. December the 17th, Russia issues these two documents, draft agreements for future security agreements, one for the United States, one for NATO. It is clear from everything that Putin and Lavrov are saying that they are very, very serious, and that if you don't, see our red lines, if you don't address our concerns, and they were very much to do with NATO expansion, Ukraine, and Ukraine within NATO. If you don't address that, we will act unilaterally. They said explicitly, we will take military technical measures. So, you can say, why did they just allow this to happen? I guess they thought Russia was bluffing, which just showed their stupidity, because the Russians don't bluff. Poker is not a national game in Russia. That chess is a national game, so they don't bluff. So when Putin said, if you don't take our concerns seriously, we will act unilaterally, that wasn't a bluff. But the Biden people just sort of ignored it. So it's an act of absolute wanton recklessness.
So now the way it's being covered right now, it's like it was a drive-by shooting by Russia, that they went in there and just this unprovoked, incursion into Ukraine. But there are seeds here. You just laid out the seeds. And going back to 2014, the coup that happened, so they were pushed there with that coup. And then you push them further in 2021. And so, they were kind of boxed in. It's like nobody wants to see a war. But even if you ask these questions to somebody, which I'm asking you, it's verboten in the West. You can't even discuss it anymore without being like you're a Putin puppet. I want to know. I have a right to know what this is all about, what the genesis of this conflict was, all right, what it is. And so now we've got these sanctions, which I think are self-defeating. I'm paying $5 a gallon for gas here. The price of bread is up 25% in the last month. Everything, inflation is going up. And it doesn't seem to be affecting Russia that much. You said they've implemented plans. They had understood that this was going to happen, the backlash, and they were well aware of it and they planned for it. So can you go into that for a few minutes?
Well, that's right, because you have to keep in mind Russia is more or less an autarkic system. They've got they're self-sufficient in food. They're very rich in natural resources. They'd only started taking part in the world economy during the last 2-3 decades. During the Soviet era, they were more or less out of the world economy. They were essentially ran an autarkic system. So, and they were under sanctions. So the Russians are very well used to this. And, they knew that the sanctions were coming. They absolutely had no illusions. That when they recognized the Donetsk and Lugansk as independent republics, they knew they'd be hit with sanctions. So they had no illusions that this was coming. But the point is that the world needs Russia much more than Russia needs the rest of the world, because Russia is not only a huge coal, oil, and gas exporter. Russia is a big wheat exporter. Russia is a big fertilizer exporter. Russia is a big, exporter of rare earths, rare metals, whether it's cadmium, molybdenum. So all kinds of materials that are essential for industry. So, if you start messing around with that, and the Russians haven't yet retaliated, by cutting off any of their vital exports. So, but the West, by imposing these sanctions, they they're undermining their own economy, and particularly with what they did when they seized Russia's central bank reserves, because that's a very serious step. This is the country's foreign exchange reserves. Now, by doing that, they're essentially, the Western powers were signaling to everyone else saying, hey, why the hell are we're not going to hold our foreign exchange reserves in banks in the West, because they can seize them at any time. Look at India, says, well, the Americans are pissed off with us because they don't like our policy towards Russia. What's to stop the Americans from seizing our foreign exchange reserves? And everybody's thinking about that. Yeah. There's a reason why the Saudis are thinking, hey, well, maybe we can sell oil to China in return for the yuan instead of the dollar, because we don't want to hold dollars if, supposing, the Americans change their mind about Saudi Arabia. I mean, we had the Khashoggi thing, the Americans got, they're getting started very nasty about Khashoggi, or the Americans suddenly changed their position on Yemen. They could seize our dollars. So now there's a kind of, the rest of the world is sort of rushing around and thinking, well, we don't want to hold our money in dollars and euros. So this huge step that the West undertook is a major blow against them. It's a real, shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, taking the big rock, as George Galloway said, giant rock, dropping it.
Absolutely, you're dropping it on your own foot, because people would hold dollars and euros because that's they were confident. You have dollars, no one's going to mess with you. You're holding it in your bank. But if you think, well, at any time the Americans could just take it away from us, our foreign exchange reserve, just like the Bank of England seized Venezuela's gold, then why would anyone want to hold their reserves in the Bank of England? Why would anyone want to hold any of their foreign exchange earnings anywhere in the European banks? And the same thing goes with all the seizures of these Russian oligarchs, or they call the oligarchs, or their property. I mean, if you start seizing people's property without proper legal recourse and without any compensation, then then rich people around the world are saying, well, I'm not going to hold my buy a property in London or in New York or in Monte Carlo, if at any moment you could just take it away from me, with no legal redress, no compensation. So that's it. Again, you're under. Europe is doing very nicely with all these rich people buying up land and property. That's going to go by the wayside as well.
I'm looking at Switzerland as participating in the sanctions. I believe, which everyone uses Switzerland as the safe haven place. I mean, right. What would that do to the dollar if in fact a new currency emerges and it's used, whether it be rubles or the rupee or the yuan? What or some joint kind of configuration here, currency-wise? What would happen then?
I think the dollar would just, I think the dollar would just take a real hammering. I mean, people buy dollars because they think they're buying value. If they don't think that they're buying any value, they're not going to buy dollars. And then that means they're not going to buy any treasuries. Why would you want to have treasuries? What do they do for you? So, and if the people aren't buying treasuries anymore, then how does the United States finance its trade deficits? How does it finance its budget deficits? I mean, it's been this wonderful system the United States created, whereby all they have to do is to manufacture dollars. Other countries have to, work, produce things in order to earn dollars. The United States can just simply print dollars, and they know that people are going to buy up dollars. They can.
That's our biggest export, huh? Dollars.
It's the biggest export, exactly. And suddenly, if people don't want it anymore, wow, then you've got a real problem, because then you have to address, the deficit. Other countries don't have to. Other countries don't have the privilege of running up huge deficits. The United States does, because it manufactures dollars, and so it can just run up deficits indefinitely.
I don't think they know what to do at this point. Right. Just ad-libbing from day to day. trying to squeeze more sanctions. They don't know how to get themselves out of the jam that they put themselves in.
I think it's absolutely right. And I think if you see what's happening today, where they're manufacturing another Russian atrocity, they try to whip up the idea that the Russians have conducted mass executions in this town, Bucha, close to Kiev. Obviously a fraudulent story. I mean, it just smacks of fraud, particularly, again, if you followed the events in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 90s, there were endless of these stories about these supposed atrocities. But why are they doing it? I think they're doing it because they're running out of options. We've had they've imposed the sanctions. The sanctions haven't delivered. Clearly the Western powers have been hurt more by the sanctions than Russia has. You have these German industrialists who are telling Chancellor Scholz, hey, you're out of your mind to start imposing any more sanctions because German industry is just going to come to a complete standstill. And there's one thing the Germans are very proud of, it's their economy. And if that German industry, all the pharmaceuticals and all their chemicals and all their, autos, if all that comes to a crashing halt, then Germany's in a lot of trouble. So they basically told Scholz, knock it off. We need the gas and we need plenty of it. So, you're going to have to pay in rubles. You're going to have to work something out with the Russians, but no more of this nonsense that we're not going to buy gas from Russia. So that's right. So that's why they're running out of options. They can't impose any more sanctions. They can't really start getting involved in a shooting war with Russia. There's no public support for it. Despite all the MSNBC, CNN clowns who talk about, let's start, bombing Russia or whatever, there's no public support.
They're Pentagon clowns, those guys. It seems like I think the Pentagon PR department says to each other, what do we write today? They don't write anything. Let's just get the transcript from MSNBC and CNN. We'll put that out as a press release.
That's it. So that's it. They really don't have a second act. They could, put pressure on Zelensky and tell him he's got to come to an agreement. But they're now so stuck with this dogma that if only we hold out for longer, Russia is going to go down on its knees. We're going to break the Russian economy. We're going to break Putin. We're going to come out on top at the end. But it's not going to happen. So they just still keep hoping that, maybe tomorrow the Russian economy will collapse. Maybe tomorrow the Russian people will turn against Putin.
I think the most belligerent nation in Eastern Europe is Poland against the Russians. And, it's a mistake. It's the same mistake. They could have signed a defense pact with Russia, with the Soviet Union back in and they wouldn't do it. Hacha would not sign a peace agreement with Russia, a defense pact with Russia, and maybe that whole thing could have been avoided.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think it's a kind of a tragic thing about Poland is that they antagonize the big power to their east and they antagonize the big power to the west. It's not a good idea to do that. So it's the contrast between Poland and Hungary is very stark. Hungary, it has bad relations with the EU. They're all, there's always someone in the EU attacks Orban and Hungary, but Hungary has been very clever. It has good relations with Russia. It works out all sorts of economic, commercial relations with Russia, and that gives Hungary leverage. But Poland doesn't have any leverage because Poland, it has terrible, terrible relations with Russia. But then the EU is constantly attacking Poland because it doesn't like its Catholicism. It doesn't like its, its socially conservative ways. It doesn't like its attitudes towards, gays and so on. So Poland kind of has bad relations with both the EU and Russia. The only country that Poland has good relations with is the United States. Trump loved Poland. Biden also seems now to love Poland. I mean, he went to Warsaw to deliver that crazy Cold War speech last weekend, but the United States is a long way away. And, if Poland really wants to get involved in this war in Ukraine, it's going to be on its own. And I think the United States made it clear, if you go in there, you're on your own, pal.
I mean, I think they know. I think it's pretty clear that you're not going to win this with Russia right now. So they better sit down and start talking. And because the U.S. is no longer the big kid on the block, it's becoming an empty suit. It just doesn't have the clout that it wants. And we have to. There's no more U.S. exceptionalism. People are becoming hip to it, and countries are becoming aware of it. And so it's as Craig Murray said last week. It's really a dying empire, just like so many in the past. Hey, George, it's been an incredible pleasure talking to you. It's been informative. We've been talking with, and we didn't even get the name of the book again. It's only $175. You got to get that on Kindle. It's called Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. It's G. Samueli at, I believe, or is it George Samueli on?
You can follow me on Twitter. It's George Samueli as one word, and then you can also follow my podcast, which is thegaggle.locals.com. So you would do it,
and you can find that if you didn't get that, folks. You just go to George Samueli on Twitter, and he's got that all listed. Okay, I see it in front of me at the Gaggle.
That's right.
And so don't go away. We're going to talk to you, but we're going to go. I'm going to say goodbye to you personally, but we're going to go out now. It is we're a week away from the anniversary of Assange Countdown to Freedom, which we've been doing for 5 years, and also it's the anniversary of the rendition of Julian Assange. So we're going to play. Last week we had you on with Roger Waters. He's going to be here, but not live. This is Roger Waters. I Wish You Were Here. This is him singing it at a march in London sometime in 2020. I want to thank you all for listening. I'm Randy Credico live on the fly here on Assange Countdown to Freedom. And here we're going out for Roger Waters. And we'll see you next week.
So you think you can tell heaven from hell, blue skies from pain? Can you tell it from a cold steel red, a smile from a veil? Do you think you can tell? And if they get you to trade your heroes for ghosts, hot ashes for trees, and hot air for cool breeze, cold comfort for change, and then you exchange a walk-on part of the war more